Welcome to my talk. This is how to build better gameplay by smashing it into pieces. My name is James Arthur, and I am Principal Technical Level Designer at Sumo Newcastle. And apologies if you came here looking for a technical design talk or a level design talk or even a talk about being a principal. It's none of those things. It's actually a talk about game design theory in particular. It's really about challenge and variety. I don't need to tell you that they're important in games. We know that most, if not all, games provide some kind of challenge to the player to keep them entertained. And to maintain that interest, we need the challenge to be varied. Otherwise, it gets repetitive. Players get bored and they start dropping off. And a good part of a game designer's job is tuning the difficulty and managing the variety of challenges that they have over time. But I want to give this talk because there's a technique that you can use and that I have used in production to manage challenge and variety. And working with a number of different teams within Sumo and externally as well, I've noticed that some people know about this method and some people don't. It doesn't seem to be related to how experienced they are, their seniority, more about where they worked previously or where they went to university. So I wanted to share some knowledge. And if you've seen this before, apologies. Hopefully this is a nice refresher for you. And if you haven't, then hopefully this is something new. First of all, though, I want to define a challenge. I want to define it as a challenge being a situation that requires some skill which can be performed well or poorly. And the reason I want to define it like this is because immediately when you think of the word challenge, you think of something being hard, difficult, and stressful for the player. And that's not really what I mean. What I mean is that we're asking the player to do something and they can do it or they can't do it. Or they do it well, they have the opportunity to do it better or less well. And that kind of covers most things if you think about it. But that also makes a lot of sense because so many games are focused on challenge or asking the player to do something well or badly. So here's a typical challenge in an action game. This is Helldivers 2. And you might shoot at a target and hit it, or you might miss it depending on your skill. If you're being shot at, you might avoid that fire, or you might get hit and die based on your skill and the situation as well. But there's room to do well or badly, and that's what makes it a challenge. Completely different type of game, Chants of Senna. It's a puzzle game. You're supposed to make careful observations of the world. You need to juggle things in memory. You need to make deductions, and you might get an answer right, the answer to a particular puzzle. You might get it right or you might get it wrong. It's a mental challenge, but it still exists. Even Dear Esther is not a game about challenge. Challenge is not the focus of this type of game. But even so, you have some kind of skill requirements in this game, like, for example, that ledge. If I'd been paying attention, I wouldn't have fallen off that ledge. And there's not really a punishment for doing so, but I've done it kind of badly, in that particular case. And you could also argue that in a narrative game, navigating the world, piecing together a non-linear narrative requires is a challenge because you could miss some ingredients, some aspects of the plot. You could fail to make those mental connections about how things work. And the reason I mention this is because it doesn't matter how little or large the focus of challenge of difficulty is in this game. It doesn't matter what kind of challenge it is. You can still treat it the same way and moderate it the same way. So if the definition of challenge is that broad, does it cover everything? Like, what isn't a challenge? Well, a good example is a dice roll. A dice roll is not a challenge. Some random chance that comes from it is not a challenge. You know, we're not testing your ability to keep the dice on the table and not fall off. We're testing the outcome. And if you think about something like Snakes and Ladders isn't really a challenge. Like players can win or lose, but really it's the outcome of a random series of events, series of events that you have no control over. Arguably, it's not even a game in that sense, since you have no actual choice. So those I'm not counting as challenges. But Dungeons and Dragons had lots of dice rolls. It does have challenges. The skill involved is in the actions that you perform that lead to a dice roll, or predicting the outcome of a dice roll, and so on. So that involves some skill, but the random chance itself is not. It's not a challenge. Like dialogue options where the value is mostly role play. Like many RPGs do this, where you're actually, you're trying to embed yourself in the character, but actually the dialogue options just lead to the same outcome and don't really impact the gameplay in any meaningful way. You could also argue things like customization and other such things are there for the benefit of the player to encourage their role-playing fantasy, but in terms of challenge, it's a nothing. So we're discounting it here on those grounds. Just interacting with things in the world is not really a challenge. Opening a door by pressing a button is not a challenge. Pressing F to pay respects is not a challenge. Okay, you may need to navigate your way to this thing that you're interacting with, but there's no meaningful way of failing it. If it were timed, then it would be a challenge. So if I had to do it, reach a destination and press a button against the clock, that becomes a challenge. Pressing the button is not the challenge, reaching it is the challenge. If it required accuracy and had consequences if I miss it, then that would be a challenge. So like if I accidentally click on the advert that I'm trying to dismiss by pressing the close button, that's a precision challenge. But simply paying respects is not what I would consider any meaningful challenge in a game. So that's the definition of a challenge, something that the player can do and has space for them to do it well or badly. But you need to think about how the player is being challenged. And that's what I want to take you to take away today. So, for example, in Death Sprint 66, the player is remotely piloting a human body in a cybernetic future sport. And that's kind of what we're doing. The player is sitting on a couch, pressing buttons on the controller, remotely controlling an avatar. But, the challenges that they're facing aren't muscle fatigue. It's not a cybernetic implant failing, at least not yet. But the physical challenges that they're facing are pressing the buttons in the right order at the right times. And the mental challenges that they're facing are the abilities to make decisions based on what they're seeing on screen. So if you're if you've got some history of the UI UX field, then you'll have seen this before. This is called the human-computer interaction loop. And the human is on the left, and it's represented by the sensors seeing what's happening on screen, and then the brain's making some kind of decision, informing the hands to make an input on a controller, which goes back to the computer, the console, and that loops back to the screen again. And there are other sensors, apart from eyes, obviously, sound, haptics. But the loop is kind of the same, and obviously there's different input devices as well. And if you think about it, this is why we pay so much attention to the 3 Cs, the character control camera in games, because they're actually your interface with the game. The way that the camera determines what's on screen. And so it's your window into the game world, so you can identify what's happening in the game world. The controls are the inputs that you make as a player to make things happen inside the game. But apart from the 3 Cs, we tend to not think about inputs in these ways. We tend to think about the rules, the law. We tend to think about the health of an enemy and not how it's making the player's life difficult, if you see what I mean. Because in fact, the only way that you can make gameplay more challenging is to make the player's choices and inputs harder. When you are affecting some stats in a stats table, or the health of an enemy, or the DPS of a gun, or the jump distance of some of your character, you are indirectly affecting the inputs and the decisions that the player is making them easier or harder in some way. And what I like to get across is that you can start thinking about things a little bit more directly about if your goal is to increase the challenge, then think about all the different ways that you can increase the challenge and not think about simply like stats in a stats table. So the only way you can make gameplay more challenging is to make the player's choices and inputs harder. But you can take it further and you can say, well, the only way to make gameplay have more variety is to make the player's choices and inputs have more variety. Make those button presses different. Make those decisions and the type of choices that you have to make them different. So if there's one thing or two things that you take away from this talk, I would say this is the most important. Try and think in this from this point of view. But we need to go deeper. So like the very clickbaity title says, I want to break this gameplay down into pieces, tiny little pieces. So here's Helldivers again, and this is the least chaotic video I could possibly make of Helldivers, but this is aiming and shooting. So what we're going to do is, there are all these other mechanics in the game, but aiming and shooting is one of the primary ones, and we're going to isolate it and only consider what it means to aim and shoot at a target in this game. And if you break it down to what's being asked by the player, you have a crosshair and you have a valid target region, and you use the pad to move the crosshair over the target, and then you pull the trigger. Or the mouse and keyboard, or whatever. But ultimately, this is what aiming and shooting is. It's precision challenge on the player, because they have to operate the stick on the pad very precisely to move the crosshair over the target, and then at the right time they have to pull that trigger. So if that's what we're testing the player on, then by increasing the difficulty of that precision task or increasing the difficulty of that timing task, we make the game harder. And if we make it easier by reducing the precision on the and the timing on the pad. And anything that you do, like I say, like increasing the health of the enemy, will indirectly affect those things. But here's some things that you can do directly to affect the difficulty of these inputs. So one of the most obvious ones is the size on screen. So if you make it bigger, then you need to be less precise to hit that hitbox, and you need to be less precise with your timing, and so it becomes easier. And if you make it smaller, then you need to be more precise, and your timing needs to be better, and so it's harder. Right? So size on screen is a parameter. We call it a parameter. It's one individual thing that we can tweak to make this particular situation easier or harder. And like, notice that we don't really care about the size of the enemy. We care about the size of the hitbox on screen. We care about that window that players are seeing on screen. Because if that same enemy, if that was closer, it would have a larger hitbox. But that would mean that it has less. It would require less skill to hit it if it was closer, and more skill to hit it if it was farther away. So it really depends on that valid target area that you're trying to hit. Another one would be lateral speed. Obviously, a stationary enemy is easier to hit than one that is moving, and the faster it moves, the harder it is to track and follow and hit. So this is another parameter that we can change, and you'll notice that it's completely independent of the size of the enemy on screen. Increasing the difficulty of the lateral speed doesn't increase or decrease the size of the enemy on screen. Um, Window of opportunity. This is another one. It's like, well, you know, if the target is always there, then that's going to be easier than a target that periodically becomes unavailable. And we're not just saying that it, disappears out of thin air, but maybe it uses cover, and that removes that valid target area that's on screen. Maybe it brings up some kind of shield. Maybe it ducks behind cover. All of these things are ways that we can remove the window of opportunity. But in terms of this theory, actually, they're equivalent. It's still removing the valid hitbox from the screen. So, these are probably the most obvious ones. These are the most obvious ones I thought of that affect those things. But you can go into more and more detail. There's some others as well. Distance from the crosshair. You can imagine that if you don't actually have to move the crosshair, that's easier than one where you have to move the crosshair to target some enemy behind you. Predictability, is it traveling in a predictable way, or is it going to disappear randomly from sight? And then duration, like how long do you need to track it for? How long do you need to hold that trigger down? And then so finally we have the time to kill. The parameter that we go to immediately when we think, okay, how do we make like some enemy in a shooting game harder? We up its health. Well, this is just one parameter out of several that we can use to change the difficulty of a situation. But it's the one that we always go to because it's just a value in a data table that's easy to tweak. But there are all these other ones that can provide more variety in a particular situation. And there may be more, right? It depends on your game. Depends which one you want to stress in your particular game. Even different shooters might have different parameters. You could probably make this list extremely long, but then you go mad doing that. You could. It's probably best to kind of keep it to like 5 or 6. So just a quick example. Just watch this wee guy with the swords. He's quite small there. He's obscured. The window of opportunity disappeared. Now he's running for me. Now I'm panicking because there's other mechanics in play that make me wary about my health. I've zoomed in, so he's even bigger on screen. And now he's so close to me that it was just an easy snapshot that took him out, even with my poor aim. Here's another way that you can adjust the size of the hitbox on screen. If a teammate is to run in front of your field of view, it reduces the valid hit area that you have there. If I'd fired, then it would have been even worse for me. I'd probably have died in the explosion as well as them. But yeah, so the idea is that think of it in terms of the valid area that you can see on screen, the valid area that you're trying to hit, how difficult it is to get to that valid area in any particular moment in time. And as designers, you can't control all of these factors. Obviously, you can't control that a teammate is going to run in front of your camera, but you can be aware of how it affects the gameplay, and you can use it to guide you in your design. You can break down other games in the same way. We're talking like let's have a look at Metal Gear Solid. Stealth avoidance, trying to avoid being seen by the enemy. And you think, well, what's the player's goal? What are we asking the player to do in this particular situation? And I think, thinking about what the pad inputs we want to press and what the success conditions are and what we're actually asking the player to achieve, you can boil it down to something like the player must maneuver their character within valid areas of the game world and avoiding invalid areas of the game world. So you can even see on the radar, there's a vision cone of that enemy. That's an invalid area. And perhaps everything else is a valid area that you can move within. And you can imagine that as a situation where you might want to adjust different areas, the size of different areas, the speed of these areas, the visibility of these areas, the window of opportunity and the predictability of these areas. And they're precision and timing challenges as before, but on different pad inputs. And I would say that observation and pattern recognition is much stronger in this particular type of gameplay. That like it's less focused on reactions and aiming and shooting at a target, getting that crosshair pin perfect, and more about knowing when to move and reading the situation and making a plan and executing it. So yeah, so that's how to smash your gameplay into pieces. This is how to break it down. So one, you isolate your main mechanics, aiming and shooting, for example, or the stealth mechanic that I just showed you. You want to break down the gameplay into what it is from the player's point of view. You're moving a crosshair over a target area and pulling the trigger. That's what defines whether it's a success or a failure for the player. You're trying to get from A to B without moving your character inside an invalid target area. That's what defines success from the player point of view. So when you've done that, you can work out what the skills are that the player's using, precision and timing, for example. And then from that, you get a list of parameters. And these, in my experience, these tend to come quite easily once you have all those three things nailed down. Size of the target area, the lateral speed of on screen. Just remember to always think about the player's point of view, looking at the screen while they're sitting on the couch, pressing buttons on a controller. So yeah, and then you win, right? That's the solution. But you're already game designers. You've done this before. Like you can balance challenge and difficulty without having done all of this stuff and without all of this theory. So you're probably asking why I'm saying you should do that and what are the benefits of thinking in this way. So I'll give you one simple reason. Like it reminds you what levers you have to tweak gameplay. So when you're in development, especially when you're reaching the end of development and you're in the balancing phase and you're trying to think about how to make things easier or harder or more varied from one situation to another, it's very easy to think of that one thing. Very easy to forget that there's other things available to change the difficulty. You know, I've worked on stats-based shooters in the past, and if you just spend all your time increasing the time to kill to make things harder, then your enemies feel spongy. It feels unsatisfying. It starts to feel boring. You need to have a mix of all of these different parameters to make things easy throughout the course of the game, and make things more interesting throughout the course of the game. So practical use number one is to remind you of all these parameters that you can use, all these different ways that you can make things more difficult or easier in more varied ways. Yeah, like I say, it's easy to become myopic in production, and sometimes you need to break it down and you need to kind of list out all of these things that you have available to you, because sometimes you just end up thinking that you have just one thing. But there's more. You know, this is a game design talk, so what would a game design talk be without Excel? You can list these parameters in a table, and then you can put, you can rank them. You can quantify what an easy, medium, or hard challenge would be, or even what a no challenge situation would be, where you're not actually testing something. So you do that for each parameter, and you do a table like this for each mechanic. And you can, you know, taking this mixing analogy, you can consider each parameter to be like a fader on a mixing desk, you know, a lever or a switch. And just like on a mixing desk, if you were to push one lever slightly higher, it would increase the volume in that particular challenge just slightly higher. And really, the mix comes from a combination of different parameters and different extents. And you know that on average, if you push them further to the right, it's going to be harder, and if you push them slightly to the left, it's going to be easier. But really what you want in each situation is you want a mix where you're testing the player in some specific kind of areas. Like in this case, it's quite tanky. They need to track and shoot for a long time at an enemy, and they need to move the crosshair some distance away to hit it. So these are the challenges that you're testing, but you're not testing them on the window of opportunity. But a different mix of things would just use exactly the same mechanic, exactly the same parameters, but it would provide a completely different situation. This particular test is testing the size of the screen, so it's very much a precision test. And if you were to list out all the enemies or ingredients or levels in a game side by side, you can map out that variety. So in this case, I've just ranked 4 hypothetical enemies on all the different parameters that we've provided. And you can see when I put them side by side and color code them, you can see that each enemy tests something differently, tests 1 or 2 things, and none of them are exactly the same. All of them have different signatures, all of them have different patterns. And that's ideally what you want, to provide variety from different things. And remember, this is all still from aiming and shooting. But quite often, if you do this analysis later on in development, so say like towards the end of development, you've had a play test and you've, people are saying, oh, all your enemies are the same. There isn't a lot of variety over time. And you can do this analysis and you'd probably see something like this, which would show up that the same kind of parameters are being tested and some are kind of lying fallow and not being used enough. And so when you see this kind of thing, you can find solutions for these things as well. I want to tweak those things, tweak the balance of those enemies in different ways. This is something that I did for Hood, Outlaws, and Legends. So if you're familiar with level design variety charts, you're probably used to putting each of the levels on one axis, each of the missions or scenarios along one axis over time, and then on the other axis you list all the ingredients, which are kind of done here in sort of like the top half of the table, but the bottom half of the table is based on difficulty instead of whether they're used or not, or how many of them are used or not. So, and in terms of difficulty, I'm not listing all of the individual parameters, but I am thinking about it in terms of the player's inputs and whether it would make the player's life easier or harder in this particular way. And often, sometimes these ingredients are obvious. If you have traps, then the more traps there are, it usually makes things harder. But not all ingredients will be the same. And by laying it out in this way, you can actually see which parts of the game are testing the players in which way. Because you want to kind of like have that variety, and there's no there's no coincidence that these 5 levels in Hood are all different. They all have different signatures because that was deliberately the intention. So that's the second reason to use a variety matrix, either in level design or in game design, to highlight problems and to find potential solutions for them. So my final reason for doing this, imagine a scenario where you're at the end of production and you've had your playtest feedback, like I say, and you've done your variety matrix, but you can't do anything about it because the systems that you've offered have no flexibility. All you've got is that data table with the parameters that have been given, and that's been developed, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months ahead of time, and now making any kind of changes is hugely problematic. So the thing is that you can do this kind of analysis quite early on in production. In fact, like as soon as you realize what the core gameplay is, like if you've got an aiming and shooting mechanic, you can quite early create a list of parameters. And because you can create a list of parameters, you can bake that into your design documents. And you can have that in your systems so that even if you don't need them at the start of production, when you do need them towards the end of production, they're there ready for you to help tweak things. But there's a slight problem with putting them directly into design docs. So like I mentioned before, the size on the screen isn't exactly what is what matters. The size of the enemy isn't what matters. It's that size of that hitbox on screen. So how do you translate that into something that you can actually put in a design doc? Well, you have to take a step upwards. You have to think about, okay, what things affect the size of on screen? What affects the size of that hitbox, the shape of that hitbox, how fast that hitbox moves, how fast or how available it is, and so on and so on. And so once you start thinking about the things that will you can do to affect that, you can create a list, and that list might not be immediately obvious. Obviously, physical size of the enemy is one of those things that will affect the size on screen in some way. But you might also think about it in terms of weak points. Maybe we could make those if we add weak points, the valid area on screen becomes much smaller. Maybe you could think about it in terms of AI behavior. Okay, we can't control exactly where this enemy is on screen, but we can make the AI try and keep a certain fixed distance between the player and itself, so that it is a reasonably manageable size on screen most of the time. Or you can think about it in terms of aim assist, because aim assist kind of affects the valid target area as well, artificially inflating the size of that valid target area that you can shoot at. Remember, you're really thinking about, like, if I move the crosshair and pull the trigger here, is it a valid place to do that or not? Is it a good place to do it or not? And there are other things as well, like the context matters. The position of that enemy in the world matters. Whether there's cover for it to use, that matters. Partially covering that hitbox. Whether there is a vantage point for the player that is at a set distance from the enemy, so that they will be a certain speed, certain size or speed, depending on what parameter you're choosing. So it's a combination of game design and level design context, and sometimes it's easy to forget as well that these level design parameters need to be factored into the design as well. We need to be able to place them at certain points. We need to be able to let them use cover, or the level designer needs to understand that cover can be used to affect the size on screen. And if it affects the size on screen, then it affects the overall difficulty of that particular situation. So that when you're trying to balance things, you have this medley of game design core ingredients and level design ingredients that are both contributing to the overall difficulty, challenge, and variety, the things that you're testing on a moment-to-moment basis. So that's my final use for it, is that you can make sure at the start of development that your systems support the variety that you need. You can make sure that your game design documents have all of these things listed, and that you're supporting them in some way, so that when you actually use them, you have the flexibility that you need to create variety in all the encounters in the game. So that's it for now. Thanks very much. Over to questions.